Hey, hey, Drive North with Meg Ellison. Thanks for joining me. Glad to have back from Institute for Reforming Government, Jay Curtis. How are you?
Great. How are you, Meg?
Good, thank you. So let's start by doing something fun and talking about Hutch, right? You did some kind of competitive
The Murph.
Murph. Oh my gosh, I got it wrong. Oh, sorry. Yeah,
Yeah.
so we won't hit rewind and retake it.
No, that's
It's just
fine.
as it is. But yeah, so that was I remember we talked about that probably when you did it last. And so how does a guy prepare for it? Do you build a whole bunch of stairs, or do you just like go up and down your stairs in your home or
Well,
downtown Milwaukee?
yeah, it's a great workout. It's every Memorial Day, and a lot of gyms kind of put something together to honor those who have fallen, and that's really what Memorial Day is all about. So it's Lieutenant Murphy died in, I think it was Afghanistan. And so he would do these workouts, and they're intense. It's a mile run, 100 pull-ups, 200 push-ups, and 300 air squats, and you go and run a mile again. And technically, you're supposed to do it in a 20-pound weighted vest. So lots of people do it. My times have gone consistently down over the years, or I should say up, right? So I'm getting slower, but it's just a great activity this year. My daughter did it with me last year. Actually, the whole family did it. So it's just a fun thing to do. My wife and I are members at a local gym, AMRAP, in Grafton, and so it's just a great group activity. And it's just a nice way to obviously do something fun with the family, get some exercise in, but then ultimately, I mean, truly thinking about what Memorial Day is. I know it's kind of cliche, but obviously good to have family time, barbecues, and all that. But I do think it's important just to find time over that weekend just to think about the men and women who have made the ultimate sacrifice. Right? It's if other than some brief periods in U.S. history, we have an all-volunteer force. So these are men and women that have chosen voluntarily to join the military, and the reality is some of them, pay the ultimate price to defend our freedom. So it's just a cool way to just even for that hour to think about what people have gone through, and it's still happening today, right? I mean, we still have service members that pay the ultimate sacrifice, whether it's in combat. I always remind people, if you look at the number of service members that die in training, right? It's amazing what some of our service members do to train. Right? They don't just go into theater and start shooting, right? They train for years in many cases, and that comes with risk. I believe during World War II, more service members died. Maybe we'll get fact checked on this, but I think it's more, but or if not, it's a significant number of service members that died in training during World War II, because in many cases, right, the joke is, we're building the plane as it takes off. I mean, in some cases during some of these operations, the Department of Defense was literally building planes and then sending service members up to make sure they worked, and sometimes they didn't. So yeah, just a great thing to do, and you can scale it. So if listeners want to try next year, yeah, it's not bad to start training in advance, but if you just want to do a scaled version and give it a shot, go for it.
Pretty sure I told you last time we talked about it, I was just exhausted hearing you talk about it. So
You
there
could
you
do
go.
it. You could do it.
Um, so remind me again, uh, uh, um, aren't you former military, Jake
I
Curtis?
I'm in the guard, the air
Okay.
guard. Yeah.
So not even former, currently serving. So I say thank you for your service as well. All right, so let's dive in. Since we last spoke, I know that there is a new judicial scorecard that IRG has put together. Talk about what it is, and then also you've got your Court Watch website. And it's interesting that in 2026, I mean, and, I guess you could take it a couple different ways, but is it, um, well, is this what we have to do? Is really watch our judges even? I mean, is this where we are in the world where we have to pay close attention to the way in which our judges are deciding cases and interpreting law?
Absolutely, and I think that's a really nice summary of what we're trying to do. Frankly, I don't think this is unique to Wisconsin. Um, the judiciary is, I think, often the most overlooked branch. It's really only when a huge decision comes out that the public really even pays attention, which is understandable, right? Whether it's the state level or the federal level, a lot of attention is given to the executive branch. I would argue, particularly at the federal level, probably too much attention. The legislative branch, Congress at the federal level is equally important, right? We have co-equal branches of government. Um, and so it's natural. I think our founders kind of knew that was going to be the case, that it would be the kind of least political branch, and therefore probably not as much attention given to that branch. And so, you know, at IRG, right, we're not assuming that we're going to be able to change really just a structural feature of our form of government, whether it's the federal or the state level. But particularly here in Wisconsin, I think it's fair to say if you are not satisfied with the current direction of the court, if you're disappointed in the recent election results, we kind of need to start at ground zero and maybe refocus and do some just basic education of what is our court system. And obviously, there's lots of resources available, but as you alluded to, irgcourtwatch.org is our new website. So it's separate from reforminggovernment.org, which is IRG's main website. And the kind of the goal here is to have just one site completely dedicated to Wisconsin courts, starting with obviously the Supreme Court, but also the Court of Appeals and the circuit courts, right, the trial courts in the state. And so part of it is just basic education, just familiarizing Wisconsinites with what are the courts, who's on the courts, but then obviously taking a step further and trying to provide some analysis as to, okay, when you look at the Supreme Court, we had 15 years of essentially conservative control of the court. That has changed, right? You and I have talked about this. Unfortunately, we're not on a good streak right now from the center right movement. We are not winning these Supreme Court races. Obviously, well, we'll see if it was rock bottom, but this spring was not the outcome anybody wanted. A 20-point loss by Judge Lazar, who's a very good judge. And I think that's kind of telling. And the year before, in 25, I would argue we had a very good candidate who himself was a good judge, a Waukesha Circuit Court judge, former Attorney General Brad Schimmel. Judge Lazar is a Court of Appeals judge out of District 2, which is Waukesha. So I think it's the kind of the lazy response is to always just blame the campaigns. I think certainly Judge Lazar, I think there's some valid criticism there as far as kind of her messaging. But she's a good judge. Her base is Waukesha County. Going back to 25, Brad Schimmel, right? You had somebody who had won statewide for Attorney General in 2014, lost in 2018, but by a close margin in a year where obviously Governor Walker lost as well. He had a good operation. He lost by 10 points. And so if you're looking at this objectively, there clearly are some structural problems, and the center right movement is at a disadvantage when it comes to and we just have to start with the funding, right? The funding is just it was there in 25, it was not there in 26, and then also I think when we talk messaging, and this is kind of not, we don't do politics at IRG, but if we're going to talk about like what courts do and why it matters, I mean, we have to have something more behind that other than, well, this appears to be a progressive judge, this appears to be a conservative judge. Well, what is a progressive court? What does that mean? And that's what we're trying to do with Court Watch, to actually put some kind of objective analysis to that. So we launched the website, which I encourage your listeners to check out. It's a great website. We're going to continue to make it better, but we think it's pretty user friendly. Tons of resources there. I think the biggest resource that we put out recently is a scorecard. There's really one other think tank that I think has done a good job out of Oklahoma that has put together a scorecard. Frankly, I think ours is better in that it's there are two parts. Half of it looks at key cases. So that's typically how a lot of scorecards operate, right? You look at kind of key cases with respect to a legislative scorecard, key bills. We looked at the 10, in our view, most critical cases, made a determination as to what we think was kind of the constitutionally sound decision, and then scored the justices on that. The other half is, and admittedly the more difficult part, but what I think sets the IRG scorecard apart, I would argue really the first of its kind in not only in the state but in the country, that actually went through various metrics and actually scored the justices on, how are they actually looking at core principles, separation of powers, textualism, precedent. Do they respect precedent? If the court just recently decided a case and then decide a case in a completely different direction, the only difference being the makeup of the justices and maybe the ideology of the justices, well, that's not following precedent in an appropriate way. And so when we went through that analysis, and I'm just going to kind of quickly run through, it is interesting when you take those two components and you stack them up. No surprise, Justice Rebecca Bradley scored the highest at 96.4. Justice Ziegler scored 95.3, and then Justice Hagedorn was 84.8. So you had three solid center-right justices that scored well. The problem is, right, Rebecca Bradley is now will be off the court as of August 1st, replaced by clearly a progressive justice. And then Annette Ziegler has announced that she is not running. And so we'll have another election next spring. And that will leave Justice Hagedorn. And you look at the scores of the other four justices. Ann Walsh Bradley, who obviously is now off the court, she was at 59.4. Rebecca Dalitz, 60.8. Jill Karofsky, 59.6. And then Janet Protasiewicz, 61.7. That's a problem, right? You have four of the seven who, when applying these objective metrics and then also looking at the cases that really matter, they don't score well. And one thing quickly, and then I'll stop, but I'm sure people will say, we're cherry picking the cases. Well, frankly, I think most even left-leaning groups would agree with the cases we chose. I think there were 24 or 25 decisions last term, historic low in the number of decisions that this court is issuing. And the reality is, you probably have three categories, and very, very broad categories here, but you have criminal decisions, which, not to say those aren't important, but actually there's pretty close alignment with the court on those issues. You look at maybe a second category of, let's just call it like technical procedural cases where it gets to the Supreme Court. It's not to say it's not important, but I think whether, I forget it was this term or the last term, self-authentication of affidavits, a very big deal in civil litigation. I can't imagine, right, the general public really has any knowledge on that. And then more importantly, kind of our standard is, does it impact state government operations? And clearly cases like that don't. I mean, they're important for litigation and for the court system. So when you kind of categorize them that way, I think even left-leaning groups would agree the cases we chose were the big ones, right? Call versus Urmansky, the abortion case. There were a number of kind of administrative law cases that really has pulled away the authority of the legislature to review proposed rules, and that's going to have significant impact going forward. We're already seeing that agencies relying on guidance documents that have received no legislative oversight or approval. And unfortunately, we're going backwards, right? We're going kind of the pre-2010, or excuse me, 2011, right? So the year Governor Walker was elected, you know, those are significant decisions where agencies had, frankly, more authority than I think they were entitled to. And one of I think, the biggest impacts of the Walker administration was ensuring that agencies had oversight, which I always point out is ironic when you think about it, right? Agencies are within the executive branch. One of the most, I think, profound things that happened during the Walker era was that if you think about it, Governor Walker was essentially, giving up some authority, right? They were his agencies. They were agencies within the executive branch. He was the governor, but he had the foresight and the belief in a core principle to know that the legislature should have the ability to review administrative rules. I mean, one of the things was an emphasis on economic impact statements, right? How much is a proposed rule actually going to cost the regulated community, which isn't just businesses, right? That's consumers, individuals, local units of government, which obviously then pass those costs on to the taxpayers. So that was something that didn't exist pre-Walker, and in a way really made it more difficult for his own agencies to propose rules. And I saw that firsthand. I was chief legal counsel under Governor Walker towards the tail end at DNR, and it made our job harder. But that was a good thing, right? When a rule was proposed out of the DNR, there was a lot of hurdles we had to go through to justify that, and the legislature had the ability to exercise oversight. Unfortunately, there were a couple key cases that have pulled that authority back. Another resource on our website under Court Watch is right. Everything I've talked about so far is looking back. One of the things we want to also do is look forward. What are the cases that are currently pending, that are working their way through the court system, that people are going to care about? Again, not just our opinion, but does it impact state government? I believe you and I have talked about this, right? Act 10. There's a challenge to Act 10. A Dane County Circuit Court judge has already struck it down. That decision is stayed, and it's currently at District 2. I mean, at some point, probably within the next 6 to 12 months, that case is going to be before the Wisconsin Supreme Court. Overturning Act 10, and we know this, right? A lot of our friends in the center-right movement have tried to put a number to that. It's a big range, but depending on how you calculate it, Act 10 has probably saved 15 to 30 billion dollars. Okay, if Act 10 goes away, where does that additional funding come from? I mean, it's going to hit the taxpayers in the form of property taxes.
So, why the historic low? And maybe that's a good thing in light of the makeup of the Supreme Court and the number of cases that they have heard.
That's a good question. I don't know if I have really much of an answer there. We've looked at this. There's an attorney out of Milwaukee that does a great job, I think, on Substack. Caleb Gerbitz. I encourage you to, if you're interested in this issue, to look at his work. There's a professor at Marquette that has looked at this. I don't know, but it is accurate to say that historically these are some of the least productive years out of a Supreme Court, and there are some nuances, right? I can't remember what year it was. I think it was maybe in the 60s or 70s, right? We added the Court of Appeals. So there were years where really it was trial court, Supreme Court. And so in those years, the court was issuing, literally hundreds of decisions every year. So set that aside, even in, let's just say, the current era where we had the Court of Appeals, most years you would still see 70, 80 decisions out of the Supreme Court. So objectively speaking, this has been every year kind of the number goes down. It has been a very low producing Supreme Court. And it'll be interesting this year. I mean, we every week, Monday morning, when we have our team call, you can actually see which decisions are being released that week by the Supreme Court. And we've had a couple weeks where it's nothing, right? Nothing's coming out of the court this week. The term ends, June, July. So at some point, they're going to have to start releasing some decisions. There were oral arguments on some of these cases. So it'll be interesting to see if it's even less than that 24, 25. Depending on how you count it, there's some orders in there. But I mean, let's just say the number was 25 decisions last term. It'll be interesting to see if they're actually less than that. I don't know. Maybe this court is being more selective, right? Obviously, just like the U.S. Supreme Court, they can deny certification, right? In which case, if there's a Court of Appeals decision, that decision stands. So maybe this new majority is just being more selective in the cases they choose. I think, and this is where it's kind of a puzzle when you piece this all together. And again, you can go to our website, irgcourtwatch.org, to check this out. But we have a recent released report that looks at the cases that are working their way through the system. And if you look at that, I mean, there is some politics here, right? One of the other key cases, you have Act 10. There's a case out of Eau Claire County, a challenge to the school funding formula that got a lot of headlines. We also think it's a backdoor attempt to undermine, if not kill, school choice in the state of Wisconsin. That's another big case that's coming forward. And so I wonder maybe if this court is keeping an eye on those cases and deciding, how aggressive do they want to be. I mean, because there's going to be groups like Law Forward on the left. I would argue that's kind of the equivalent of Will on the left. They're probably identifying, what are the big wins that they want. And maybe the court is looking at that. I don't know, but it's fair to say they don't produce a lot of opinions. But some of the opinions they issued last term were significant.
So, what about, I'm just curious what your reaction was to, I mean, this unusual alliance between the majority of the Republicans in the legislature and Governor Tony Evers, and the I mean, just like significant parting of ways of Governor Evers and essentially every Democrat in the legislature.
The surplus
Yes.
deal,
Yeah.
yeah. That was interesting. I'm sure Madison insiders probably have a better perspective than I do. It was certainly an interesting alliance. And look, I think there were, I think, fair questions being asked. Right, you have the surplus. I think a lot of conservatives that weren't supportive would have preferred that if we're going to do anything with that surplus, send it back to the taxpayers. But probably, I guess, just maybe in fairness to both sides, look, the reality is we have divided government, and I don't know this, but it may have been a situation where Republican leadership just thought, okay, this is the best deal we're going to get from a lame duck Democrat governor that wants to have a final flourish as he exits and have a big deal. But from what I can gather, there were a lot of conservatives that thought, look, I mean, we don't need all these different slivers of funding to to curry favor with maybe different groups. Let's just send it back to the taxpayers. But the politics definitely got interesting. You had somebody in Tom Tiffany, right, running for governor, who came out against that deal, which I think was a significant factor in all of this, because I think Congressman Tiffany, I think he's going to have a shot this fall. I mean, the Dems are in disarray, and he's a strong candidate. I mean,
In
Elizabeth,
Wisconsin. there
in
in Detroit.
Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, yes. Nationally, as you and I were talking about before, I think it is not going to be a pretty fall. But yeah, it's just we're in an interesting situation with divided government and an outgoing governor, and outgoing. It should be noted legislative leadership, right, with Voss and LeMahieu moving on, and just a lot of moving parts, different dynamics. And so, yeah, ultimately, I think if anything, there was a message, right, that we need to kind of get back to fiscal sanity. Property taxes are becoming a major issue again for a lot of homeowners and renters because their rent is going up, and one of the reasons the rent is going up is because property taxes are becoming more of a burden. So, in that scenario, send the surplus back to the taxpayers.
So, just out of curiosity, who do you think might be the new, well, assuming the Republicans uh, maintain control of the state Senate and the state Assembly? I think that they probably will in the Assembly, but it's not as certain in the state Senate. But let's just say they, I mean, I think it's a foregone conclusion that Tyler August will be the new speaker. But what about in the Senate? Who do you think will be the Senate Majority Leader?
Wow, you're putting me on the spot here, Meg.
It just popped into my head, so I'll leave
Sure.
it.
I mean, look, I have no idea. I'm not in tune with the day-to-day machinations of Madison. I mean, look, Mary Felskowski has been a tremendous leader. Obviously, I'm assuming you know her pretty well, coming from your neck of the woods. She is viewed as a kind of a rock solid conservative, fiscal conservative. Um, I mean, I think she would make a great majority leader. I think I will say I think the Senate that is going to be tough, right? There's some really difficult races. The one kind of western Milwaukee, eastern Waukesha County, that area is not trending conservative at all. I think that's going to be that's the Senator Hutton seat. That's going to be a tough hold for
We lost
Republicans.
Dewey.
We lost Dewey. If you look at the Racine, Senator Weingart, right, he's not running. That's going to be, I mean, I think it comes down to probably that seat, assuming Senator Markline can hold in southwest Wisconsin. I believe there's a race up in Eau Claire. The Senate is going to be tough. And I think, and this is where I think national trends do matter. I think it's going to be a really tough fall for conservatives nationwide. Um, we were talking previously about the enthusiasm gap. I think it is significant. I think personally, I think people are kind of underplaying that. I mean, all the enthusiasm seems to be on the left right now, and then the problem is I think there's going to be certain coalitions on the right that may not be showing up to vote. It's going to take, I think, a lot of encouragement to show up. All that being said, I think Wisconsin, right? I would agree. I think probably the assembly holds. I'm not so sure about the Senate. And look, I actually think, despite how difficult of a fall it looks to be, I think Congressman Tiffany is running a good race. Those of us who have worked with him know. I mean, he's sometimes people question politicians, policy chops. Congressman Tiffany is a policy wonk, but he also is a good campaigner. And that's a really good combination. I have said, I think I've told this story before. Last time I was in D.C. talking about admin law issues for IRG, he brought us into his office with his chief of staff, and we sat down for about, I don't know, it was 45 minutes, an hour, to the point where his staff came in and had to ask us to leave because gave him the hook, gave us the hook. But I mean, we were talking admin law reforms, both the successes that in Wisconsin, which IRG has put out a lot of reports, kind of noting how Wisconsin really has this wonderful model of admin reforms. Again, some of it's unfortunately being peeled away by the Supreme Court, but we do have the model that other states, hopefully, and we've encouraged other states to replicate what we've done with things like Act 21 and we had the Supreme Court decision in Tetra Tech, so we were ahead of the national wave of not giving agencies blind deference when they were interpreting their own the statutes that apply to their agency. And so we were, in many respects, ahead of the curve. But those are the type of issues that he likes talking about. So I think he would be an amazing governor. But right, you always there's two options for the voter, so you have to take into consideration the other side. I mean, the left right now, it is interesting, at least in Wisconsin. We're, I think, a microcosm of what you're seeing nationwide. I know there were results this week, right, that show there is a clear. It's not. I don't think it's hyperbolic to say. I mean, there is a clear socialist, not a Democrat light socialism, like actual socialist lane right now in the
And it's not
Democratic
even a
Party.
fringe part of it. I mean, I think they've taken over.
It is not a fringe. I mean, again, you look at the results this week, right? A lot of the progress in these Democratic primaries, a lot of the clear socialist leaning, if not actual socialist candidates, won those primaries. I think there was the congressional primary down in Texas. The socialists are winning. Obviously, Mamdani in New York, right? They're winning these races, and you apply that to Wisconsin. Representative Hong, I think she actually, right. I mean, is a self-identified, right, socialist. I think if the primary were held today, and I know the establishment folks on the left, they won't publicly admit this, but I think they know that if the primary were held today, I honestly think Hong wins the primary.
Kirk
Um,
Bangstad?
well, or he's going to have energy too. I mean, that's where this combination of socialism and populism is interesting. Kind of
He's being
the more
shunned, I think, from the party. So I don't know if that'll happen. I was being facetious, of course, because there's a lot of people in the northern part of the state that I don't want to say closely follow, but are aware of his antics in the Minocqua area. And I mean, it's all a big grift for him, but
but I think you're making an important point. I mean, it comes down to, right, where's the enthusiasm? Where is the energy? And right now, the energy on the left is clearly with some of these candidates who, I mean, they're going to say they're just bold, but I mean, they're articulating socialist positions. I think this week, or maybe it was end of last week, it came out. Some of the old Twitter posts from Hong, not even like slightly alluding to defunding the police. I mean, essentially eliminating law enforcement. I mean, these are extreme positions that if she's the nominee, she's going to have to defend. And so again, this is where I think Congressman Tiffany is well positioned. I think it's still going to be tough. Don't get me wrong. I mean, this is not going to be a good environment, but he has been a serious legislator. I think he's putting out some good proposals. Um, I think he's messaging it well, right? When you talk about affordability, all the polling at IRG suggests that is the key issue, and I think hopefully the right, politicians on the right are listening that affordability is an issue, right? That's, I think, one of the main reasons why Trump won in 24 was we looked at affordability under President Biden, and it was a problem for many families. It's no different today. So I think we need to ensure that we don't make the same mistake and pretend that a $4 gallon of gas is not a problem for families and for businesses, right? We all know. I think a lot of people, during COVID became educated on the supply chains and what it costs to transport goods, and so when you have $4 a gallon gas, that's a problem. You look at the housing market and how the average new family, right? If you're in a county where the average starting home price is $350,000, $400,000, right? That's a problem. But I was at a roundtable recently where Congressman Tiffany was meeting with some business leaders, and there was actually a great discussion talking about when you talk about housing affordability. Obviously, the cost of goods, the cost of labor factor in, but also local regulations. And this is where, I mean, yes, it can turn, to a kind of a policy argument that maybe the average voter isn't going to appreciate. But I think most voters understand when you have significant local regulations plus state regulations, that is going to increase the cost of housing. Um, he talked about education, which is obviously something that IRG talks about consistently as far as the standards for our kids. We can't be lowering standards, right? If we're going to have a workforce that can meet the challenges of today with AI, they can't be reading at a third grade level. It's just not it's not possible. So when you have the largest school district in the state performing at a level that's one of the worst in the country, that's a problem for the whole state. So I know Congressman Tiffany has been talking about that issue as well. So I mean, these are the issues that we talk about at IRG that really matter. The kitchen table issues, housing affordability, education standards, good government, just oversight. That's something we work on at IRG all the time. We obviously exposed what happened at DPI and the standards and the lowering of standards, and then to make it worse, doing so behind closed doors in the Dells. Right? Those are all issues that I think voters really care about.
So, last question, kind of going back to the state Supreme Court and some of the decisions that have been passed down. One, I know that wasn't like a major case, but still, let me see how I would characterize it. It was still an important decision, I guess. Is this was a unanimous decision by the state Supreme Court to, and you can correct me if I'm not getting this right, but to at least temporarily remove Judge Hannah Dugan from the bench, and that was, I mean, if I remember correctly, and frankly, I was surprised that they decided, that unanimously to take significant action because of her very egregious decisions that she made.
Yeah, so kind of two parts there. More on the kind of the procedural side, right? The Supreme Court, I think, and I think we publicly stated this, made the right decision that when you have a judge that is facing serious criminal charges, right? They can't serve, and then once convicted, they automatically surrender their seat on the bench, and the Supreme Court did the right thing there. I mean, they followed Wisconsin law. And then when you look at the case on the merits, right, it's in federal court, but she was convicted, and I think we really thought that was an important case because, again, as you alluded to, the Supreme Court actually did the right thing because, right, I think most people agree of all public officials, you can't have judges who are convicted of serious crimes continue to serve. And then I think more interestingly is from a legal standpoint is, well, what does judicial immunity really mean? And it is important to actually kind of address that specifically because right, we want judges to be independent, and I think we all would agree we don't want to open up the floodgates for judges to be sued every time a party doesn't agree with a judge's decision, right? As long as they're acting within kind of the confines of their duties as a judicial official, right? Their decisions are final. They can be appealed, right? We have due process, right? A losing litigant can then appeal a decision, and so they still have their rights if they disagree with that decision. But just to turn around and personally sue judges, I think we all agree that's not the right approach. The question is, how far does that go? And a federal jury agreed that a judge cannot be actively obstructing a federal investigation. There certainly are things she could have done if she disagreed, right? The circuit courts, right? There's individual judges in place that have kind of administrative authority that can make statements, maybe have communicated with those federal officials, but to actively try to escort a defendant in your courtroom out the back door, I mean literally, so that that individual was not apprehended by federal officials. I think we all agreed that was problematic, and so there is a line to judicial immunity. So yeah, I think that's a great example of something that the court got right from a kind of a procedural or administrative standpoint, and then on the merits, um, there's limits to judicial immunity. I think her sentencing is coming up June 6th, so kind of we'll see where that ends. I'm assuming she's going to appeal that to the Seventh Circuit. We'll see. But yeah, that's a perfect example of a case that the public needs to know. And I think many times, and this is the whole point of the Court Watch project, is there'll be 24, 48-hour flurry of articles about a decision, and then that's really the end of the analysis. What we want to do is put together kind of a comprehensive source. And look, as a lawyer that obviously has other things going on in my day-to-day practice, I remember when I was at bigger firms trying to follow what was going on at the state Supreme Court, and it's hard, right? Even as a lawyer, to constantly be reviewing decisions. Frankly, you don't have the time, and your average voter, your average Wisconsin resident that's working a job, raising a family, they don't have time to read 80-page decisions, right? Even with this low-producing court, do the math, right? You have 24 decisions. Let's say they're averaging 50 to 80 pages. Unless that's what you're doing every night, reading through every decision, you need a source that you can look to provide kind of a high-level analysis. Now, I would argue with some of our reports, if you really want to get to that next level and really understand the reasoning of the court, you can look to the terms in review. We do a term in review. So in other words, kind of a summary of all the key cases. That's all going to be, it's already on our website. The other thing I want to touch on too is in addition to the Supreme Court, we did look at the Court of Appeals. Now we didn't really assign scores, but we really looked at the 4 districts. Wisconsin has 4 Court of Appeals districts, and it's interesting because unlike the Supreme Court, that obviously takes cases statewide, the Court of Appeals essentially, right, it's a geographic area. So District 1 is just Milwaukee County. District 2 are the 12 counties surrounding Milwaukee. District 3, Meg, your neck of the woods, is essentially northern Wisconsin. And District 4 is southwest Wisconsin. Like if you look at a map, like the entire southwest quarter, based out of Madison. They're taking cases from the circuit courts in that district. And so what's interesting is the outcomes from those courts of appeal are different. District 3, your neck of the woods, Meg, a lot of environmental cases, a lot of cases impacting or relating to local units of government, because you have a lot of local units of government, right? You're a huge geographic area in District 3. District 1, a lot of criminal cases, a lot of major commercial litigation cases with the businesses located in Milwaukee. District 2 and District 4 are the most important in the sense of, again, issuing decisions that impact state government. So as we talked about earlier, the Act 10 case is right now at District 2. So we made some other observations, but there's also a report at irgcourtwatch.org that looks at the Court of Appeals. I will admit it's a long report, but if you really want to educate yourself on what the Court of Appeals does, it's a great report, because this is where it all connects. If you have a Supreme Court that's only issuing 20 to 30 decisions a term, what happens to all those other decisions that are sitting at the Court of Appeals? If the Supreme Court doesn't certify an appeal or take a case, then whatever that Court of Appeals decides, that's the decision that controls. So the courts of appeal in many of these cases are becoming the court of last resort. And so that's why, excuse me, it's really important to focus on the courts of appeal. This spring, Anthony Lococo won a seat on District 2. And so now it's going to be 4 center-right judges in District 2. District 3 has 2 center-right judges, one maybe not center-right, but they all issued solid decisions. District 4, based out of Madison, has 5 judges, and all, I think, very much left of center. And so we can't just look at the Supreme Court, excuse me, we have to look at the Court of Appeals as well.
All right. So, same website where we can find the judicial scorecard and the court watch information, all on reforminggovernment.org. Is that right?
No, no,
Oh,
there are actually separate websites.
glad I asked.
You could get there from the main IRG site, but irgcourtwatch.org is it's an IRG website, but it's completely dedicated to our Court Watch project. You can find the Supreme Court scorecard. You can find the Court of Appeals report. You can find the most recent report we put out that again looks at the cases that are pending. So decisions have not been issued by the Supreme Court, but again, if you're wondering what is this Eau Claire Circuit Court case relating to school funding, what does that case look like? We have a summary
Right.
in that report. The final thing I want to point out is you've been asking some really good questions. We have a report on the IRG Court Watch website that looks at, well, what are some things we can do to change kind of how we structure the judiciary? Should we be electing judges statewide? Should we be appointing judges and justices?
Should
So
we
we
just
kind of,
use AI?
well, I mean, these are all questions, and I think at this point, in particular, the center right movement needs to look at like are there reforms that we could implement to make the process better? Because look, I think we can all agree these elections are, I think, exhausting the electorate. Um, Governor Walker recently came out, and it was one of the things we at least proposed as an option in our report of do we move the Supreme Court elections to the fall, where there's more attention, right? There's more engagement from the electorate, and frankly, these elections are becoming so partisan. I mean, do we? And I'm not suggesting we should assign party labels to judges or justices, but I mean, let's just have it in the fall election, where right both sides come out at much higher percentages. The other suggestion that I think is worth considering is, and of all states, Illinois does it this way, is maybe electing justices by region. Because obviously, as you know, right,
Interesting.
a judge or justice out of northern Wisconsin is going to, probably have a different background than somebody from Madison or
Reflective.
Milwaukee.
Their values are more reflective of the particular part of the state that they
I think
go
that's fair to say, and
from.
I mean, and if you're concerned about money in judicial races, right, a race for a Supreme Court justice out of a district out of northern Wisconsin is going to be far less expensive than a race out of southeast Wisconsin or Dane County. So, I mean, these are proposals; they're just suggestions, but these are the type of resources we're going to have on our website, irgcourtwatch.org. And I would really encourage your listeners to, yeah, if you have the time, read it all. But if not, pick one that you think is really important. Again, I think the Supreme Court scorecard is a great place to start because it's going to get you educated on the Supreme Court, what sort of decisions they've issued, and then how the justices have voted. Right, where are their decisions? How have they actually applied some of these core principles? Because I think we're to the point where we can't just say, well, we like this judge or justice because there's something in their past that suggests they're progressive or conservative. Like, how are they actually doing the job of judge or justice? And so that's what we're trying to accomplish with our scorecard.
Okay, so you've intrigued me enough for me to ask a follow-up question about this potential to, um, uh, I was going to say hire, but elect uh, justices of the Supreme Court from different regions of the state. Is that something we could do? Would that be a constitutional amendment? Is that how we could make that happen? Or does it have to be legislation that goes through the
Yeah.
legislature?
Um, well, so it would require it would require both, I think, because you'd have to work out some of the details. I mean, one issue is you have to figure out the regions. So again, I believe the way Illinois does it is there are I think two regions in kind of the southern half of the state and they tend to produce center right justices, and then obviously several from Cook County, and so there are different ways you could formulate it, and you could even combine it, right? Doing that, I think a great proposal would be to do it regionally in the fall election when you're just going to have more interest from the electorate, and more focus, and so these are things we need to think about. Otherwise, I mean, don't forget, 2025 was, I think, close to $100 million. That was the most expensive judicial election, not only in Wisconsin history, but U.S. history for a state judicial office. And so if you don't like where things currently stand and how we're electing our justices, these are some reforms we need to think about. But I guess in answer to your question, until we get to that point, the center right movement does need to look at some of these core issues, how we message the candidates that are running, how these campaigns are funded, because we just need to be competitive. This spring, we have an election in less than a year, and right now, I know you and I talked about this. There's two progressive candidates that have already announced, Judge Burnett, I believe in Clark County, and then Judge Cologne, who's a Court of Appeals judge out of District 1. Judge Burnett clearly, I think, has articulated some progressive positions. Judge Cologne is a former Democratic legislator, so I mean, I'm not like
Great.
this isn't any secret. So last I checked, there's not a conservative candidate, and so the center right needs to think about who's running in these races. How are we going to be more competitive? Because if we don't win that race, it's going to be 6-1 with one center right justice left, and we need to start winning these races so that we have a court that is getting back to kind of an originalist view on how you decide cases. Because and again, we could, I know we want to wrap up here. We could go on forever about, and this is what our report does, is looking at some of these core principles on how they're deciding cases, because the left, they're not really even hiding it at this point. I mean, they are running campaigns based on values. I actually looked at Judge Burnett's website, and she's talking about reproductive freedom, and reigning in the legislature. So there's not really even a secret here. I mean, they're clearly running. I don't
For
want
the
to
wrong
say.
office.
Well, I was going to say, I don't want to say legislative campaigns, but they would frame it as, and I think it was Justice Protasewicz that started using this word, that they're going to run on their values, as opposed to kind of judicial principles, which I know even there's folks on the right that don't like that. But these offices are just fundamentally different. If you are running for judge or justice, you are not running for the legislature, right? You're not running for governor. You are part of the judicial branch, and you should be articulating how are you going to decide cases, not here are my values, and if you agree with them, vote for me. But that is the world we're living in right now. A Marquette poll recently put it at 85% of Wisconsinites agree that justices or candidates for justice and Court of Appeals should be running on what their values are. That's a problem. I mean, that's the reality. That's what we're in. So we need to figure out, like, okay, well, what are those values? And maybe it's just taking that term, and a value is I am not going to prejudge a case. I am not going to allow my personal views on, let's say, something like abortion to impact how I decide a case. Or if you look at Act 10, even if you disagree personally with Act 10, the question is, did the legislature at the time it was passed in 2011 have a rational basis for what they were doing? And again, whether you agree or disagree, the governor at that time, Governor Walker, and the legislature looked at the budget deficit they were facing. They looked at the cost to local units of government, and they decided, okay, we're going to change the collective bargaining ability of these units, but we don't want a lot of jailers and cops walking off the job. right? That was, whether you agree or not from a policy standpoint, there was a rational basis for what they did. So I always use that as an example of a case that you can even disagree politically. Like if you think that Act 10 was wrong, from a policy standpoint, that's different from saying that the legislature didn't have a rational basis for doing what they did. And that's why this is where, if you look at the Dane County decision that overturned Act 10, that's now stayed pending appeal, the court basically determined there was no rational basis whatsoever for the legislature to do that. I mean, that defies logic, and that's clearly just a judge who, out of Dane County, it's fair to say, personally disagreed with Act 10, and just used kind of a judicial mechanism to undermine what the legislature did, and a policy that's now been in effect, right, for the last 15 years and saved 15 to 30 billion dollars. If you disagree with that, the avenue to debate that is the legislature, not the court system.
I'm just, I don't know. There isn't a solution because I've often thought we have to remove humans from these types of decisions because, or, I don't know. I don't know what the solution is because I was thinking, do we use AI? But we're only then at the mercy of those who program.
No, look, we it's an imperfect system, but it's, the founders, I still think, right, we're 250th anniversary, right,
Yes.
of this country, and I think the founders got it right, and then obviously states like Wisconsin that came after that still formulated a lot of their governing principles on the founding vision, and government will always be imperfect, but you know we need people to. That's why it's important to align with core principles. I would call them, and I think a lot of our, when you look at like the Federal Society, they look at first principles. Well, what does that mean? First principles are, well, how do you decide a case, right? What are you looking at? That's why things like originalism and textualism matter, because it's not your personal view on a policy decision. It is the original meaning of the text. It is a respect for separation of powers, and those. They may not be trendy topics, but they still matter. And I think we need to get back to those first principles. So no, we don't want AI to make these decisions. We need our representatives in the respective branches to make these decisions. And when it comes to the judiciary, we need to get back to the basics.
Well, I guess if we have AI in charge, then AI is going to be voting too. So, and I think our objective or our jobs as concerned conservatives is to light a fire under our fellow voters, whether they're low information voters or, whatever, and
Well,
ensure that they're informed about what our messaging is, right?
I will put in a plug. I mean, IRG recently put out a report that actually looked at kind of these Trump voters. What are the issues they care about? Why do they show up or not show up to vote? That's a report. I think that's gained a lot of traction because that is a key question, right? So clearly there is a base of center-right voters in this state. I mean, that's how President Trump won in 2024. That's how he had success in this state, is because those voters showed up. The problem is they haven't showed up in other elections that matter just as much, or frankly, the reality is, if you ask the average person kind of what level of government impacts their life the most, the problem is I think some voters would say it's the federal government. And that's how they kind of rationalize showing up to vote in a presidential election. The problem is state government, and I think this is how it's supposed to be, right? State government really is the level of government. I guess I would say local government is the one that impacts you the most.
Agreed.
But if you're comparing state versus federal, it's the state governments that are going to have the most direct impact on your life. And so, and one of the things our report discovered was it wasn't that individuals, at least the ones we spoke to, didn't care about state government, one of the interesting things was they didn't feel like they had enough information to make a decision. So to your point, Meg, exactly. So we didn't even plan this. This is a perfect kind of segue. Um, they felt like they didn't have enough information, and so you're absolutely right that the center right movement needs to do a better job making it clear a race for governor, a race for Supreme Court justice, a race for state senate, state assembly. That is going to have a far greater impact on your day-to-day, how you raise your family, if you're running a business. Those are all matters that are going to be impacted at the state level,
And
not so
even
much the
county,
federal level.
city, town, boards, right?
Absolutely. I mean, local government. I mean, I guess I want to keep it higher level, but I mean, county, local units of government. If you care about education policy, being engaged in local school board races, and that's really, really what matters. And so again, the problem is there is a slice of the electorate, at least in the center right now, that doesn't see it that way. And and I'm not even being critical. That's just kind of human nature. So we need to do a better job of making it clear, like going into this fall, if you can if you care about regulations, taxes, those kitchen table issues, you should be really engaged this fall, because the federal government is not going to impact those things for the next 2 years. It's going to be your state government. So we can't just wait until 2028 for a presidential election. Individuals need to get engaged this fall. And again, organizations like IRG, we're going to do a weekend to get information out, not about politics, but about the policies that they really care about. And then hopefully candidates like Congressman Tiffany, and which I think he has been doing a good job of messaging, these are the issues that matter, and are going to impact you, and so get engaged.
Be a responsible, informed voter. And I think that's really the obligation of every adult, every voting adult in this country. So every voting citizen, I should say. Well, Jay Curtis, General Counsel for Institute for Reforming Government, irgcourtwatch.org is your website, and also reforminggovernment.org. But if you want to dive into the judicial scorecard and the IRG Court Watch, you go to irgcourtwatch.org. Thanks for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Meg.
Have a great day.
You too.